So officials need to listen and roll their sleeves up, and those conversations are now finally getting moving at the pace that we would want. They had published some draft regulations very recently at the last minute, but those don't answer all the questions that need answering. So there's some urgent work to be done on the back of their consultation on those regulations, draft regulations, to get it established. So we're obviously going to be appealing, so we're putting our legal appeal work together on this matter to try and sustain the work we've done so far. But regardless of that, we are in untested legal territory and we need proper, clear legal framework. And that needs to deal with, it doesn't just need to technically allow us to do what any common sense person would want us to do, just as you say, Chair. It needs to be really practical and expeditious. Building some big complex legal process that means it will take us years to undo these knots is not acceptable. And likewise, it needs to be able to look backwards so that it deals properly with these. It ensures the individuals we've started dealing with don't have any loopholes to come back from.
Well, I'm sure you've got cross-party support. It's got to be dealt with, and it's got to be dealt with once and for all, and I hope Yvette Cooper will manage to push that through. So thank you for that. One other thing that's occurred in the last couple of days, you've been busy, haven't you, with these things? The comments from Sam Kerr calling one of the officers stupid and white. Do you have a thought on that?
So there's been a trial. So there was an arrest, there were statements, there was a file put together. We thought there was potentially a case. CPS agreed and prosecuted. The court has acquitted after a trial. That's sort of justice, isn't it? Most people get convicted at court. Some people get acquitted. That's how it ought to be. I haven't dived into the individual details of this case, but the process has been run through, and we should move on.
Well, you can move on, but many of us are absolutely livid. You shouldn't be calling anybody stupid, and you absolutely shouldn't be referring to the colour of their skin, whatever the colour of their skin. Some of us feel very, very strongly about that, but I accept that it's difficult for you to comment. We're going to start questioning now, and it's about the Mayor's draft budget, which, of course, is going to affect you hopefully not as badly as it looks at the moment. So the first couple of questions to Madam Deputy Mayor, and if you can keep the answers as short as possible so we can get through a lot today, thank you. In what ways is MOPAC further increasing its financial oversight of the Met, and how will this be different from oversight of the London Policing Board?
Thank you. Please, I'm not French. You can either call me Deputy Mayor or Kaya, that's fine. Obviously, we know that MOPAC's oversight of the budget of the Met is important and significant. The budget is £3.6 billion of public money. Therefore, we need to make sure that the oversight is continuous. Every year we start discussions way before the spring outlook of the budget is published. We have regular meetings held with the Commissioner and his management team to scrutinise the budget, as well as regular performance meetings about the in-year monitoring of budget, so that we can make sure that we're in all areas making sure that the money that we've allocated through the budget is being spent wisely. This includes a series of seminars involving myself as Deputy Mayor and my predecessor, as well as with the Commissioner, to allow MOPAC to put together the updated budget for 25-26, which I know we've discussed in plenary.
Right, okay, and through MOPAC's regular consultations that you've referred to with the Met during the development of the Mayor's draft police and crime plan, in what ways are you assured that the comments in the final police and crime plan will be affordable for the Met?
Yes, the affordability of the police and crime plan was, at the forefront of our mind, given the timing of both of the drafting of the budget and the plan. And we've tried to work across offices in MOPAC and the police together to make sure that we have an ambitious plan, a plan that's right for the safety of London, but a plan that is deliverable and therefore affordable. So those meetings have been collaborative, and hopefully therefore we can make sure that when we're delivering the plan, as the Commissioner outlined, it's really important that we're looking at areas like high volume crime and having the neighbourhood plans to do that. So it's an illustration of how we've worked together to devise the plan and its affordability.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you. Question for the Commissioner. We heard about the tough choices in the worst case scenario. How were the individual units selected, and what assessment, what criteria have been looked at in making those choices?
Thank you for the question. Just to frame this slightly in where we are in the process, and then come to the detail on that answer. So we had a draft budget a few months ago that was based on assumptions on what might come from City Hall and from government. Because of the scale of the gap that we're anticipating, we had to get on with some detailed planning, otherwise we wouldn't be able to implement it for the year that starts in April. We're now in a situation where the numbers we talked about then in terms of over 2,000 officer reduction and about 400 staff reduction, for reasons I'll say, the picture's more generous than that now, that we haven't got to find answers, so the cuts won't be to that scale, but they'll still be very significant. The Home Office numbers were 45 million better than we anticipated, and there's a prospect there may be further benefits above that from the Home Office, and we're still in conversation with City Hall about whether that's more optimistic than we anticipated. And that's what I'm not going to go into the exact detail of where we get to now, where you've got. So I'm partway through a budget process where some parts of the budget are settled and some are uncertain. Some of the money that is granted is recurring and some of it's potentially one-off. Mm-hmm. Some of it comes with no strings attached, some comes with strings attached, and then you need to sort of check, actually, what does that mean about whether you can spend it and how you spend it. So that's going to take a bit longer to get that clarity. So that's why there's a bit of uncertainty. I'm not going to give specific numbers, but sort of a large part of the tough choices will need to be executed. I'm confident in that. In terms of how we came to that list, having framed that, so we started off with our overarching strategy, New Met for London, which sort of reflects our analysis and the priorities set for policing by the Home Office and our sort of attention to the Mayor's Police and Crime Plan. And so areas such as neighbourhood policing, areas such as violence against women and girls, we are protecting in that decision. Other areas that are under high demand, we're sort of being very careful about, such as the sort of call handling and response teams. So you end up with sort of areas that we're weaker in at the moment, like the volume crime that we discussed earlier. So you end up with, well, we need to protect these areas for different sort of either priority or vulnerability reasons at the shorthand. So once you make those choices, which about what's particularly important, which I don't think there'd be too much disagreement about, the load of those cuts falls heavily elsewhere. And so that's how we've started the process, and then we've made some sort of leadership judgments on how to do that and manage the risks that it causes best of all. Those are then some initial judgments, and we're now starting into detailed planning. And so we may initially decide, in principle, we think we might be able to take 25% out of that area, and there'll be some risk, but we'd rather do it there than elsewhere. When we do the detailed work, we might decide to take more out or less out, and we're partway through that detailed planning process. Okay, so would it be fair to say that we won't know what the final outcome is going to be for the Mayor's consolidated budget on the 17th of February, when that's published? I think in terms of the... So I presume we'll know what the Mayor's going to spend on policing. Mm-hmm. We might not know yet whether... We might not have complete clarity yet in terms of the Home Office, some of the Home Office budgets and the conditions and how we can or can't use them. And because we're only getting those numbers now, to finish off doing that maths and work out the workforce implications, what that means for tough choices, that's a small number of weeks away. Can I just add one more thing, please? I come here today realising that this is a sort of budget time of year and you want a detailed conversation, and I'm not in a position to do that, and that's frustrating for me and for you. If it was helpful to have a sort of personal briefing in a few weeks' time, we've got the detail. If you want to come to Scotland Yard, we can spend some time going through it and talk both about that and perhaps about Arrestable, the spending review going forward, and what it will take to sort of have a properly funded policing in London for the next 3 years. So I'd like to sort of reach out and say I'm up for that conversation. I'm not quite in the position to be able to do it today.
What would be particularly helpful is the cost of each of the units, you know, the proposed. So if the Royal Parks Police was to go, for example, what the saving would be to the overall budget, because we've asked for this in the past and we've never really had that level of detail. So if it could be, say, 20 million off armed response, 20 million off here, Parks Police, that's an extra 60 million. That would be very helpful to have just as a resource for us to understand the pressures that you're facing. So I was going to ask about how much will be saved, but obviously we're not going to go into the detail. But operationally, if the Parks Police is disbanded in its entirety, which is one of the choices, one of the strange things about the Royal Parks is that the ward boundaries extend into the Royal Parks themselves. So this is necessarily going to have an additional knock-on impact on the safer neighbourhood teams and their policing. So will additional resource be going in to the safer neighbourhood teams in order to enable them to police the Royal Parks in absentia of the Royal Parks Police?
Very thoughtful question. That's absolutely part of our planning to consider whether that's necessary. So if we follow through with sort of disestablishing parks as a sort of separate policing unit, it still requires some policing. The local neighbourhood policing teams is obviously where that should come from. What we'll be doing as part of the planning that's going on at the moment is assessing the workloads and actually can that realistically be absorbed by the existing teams in the neighbourhoods adjacent to the parks, or do they need some additional resources? And we'll come to a sort of sensible conclusion on that, and that's obviously the work that's going on at the moment.
Okay, would additional resources include capital items such as vehicles, electric bikes? Because I remember once I had to ask for somebody to come over from Teddington to Hampton on a Saturday afternoon, and the S&T said, yeah, we'll be there in about an hour and a half. I said, an hour and a half from Teddington to Hampton? They said, yeah, we need to wait for the next bus. Will there be the additional...
So we need to come up with something that works, don't we? So that, of course we do.
And is it fair to say, just on the basis of the final question, Chair, it's just that when you mentioned the change arrangements, that you said if you stack people with too much work, then they will underperform. Is there a risk that giving the safer neighbourhood teams this additional work of policing the Royal Parks, that they will necessarily underperform as a result of being given this additional responsibility?
So you have to make choices on the work you're going to do. So if there are fewer people in a certain area, you're going to do less work. The sort of, sometimes you can make some efficiencies with technology and you can reduce a unit by 10%, and with the technology they can cover the same amount of ground. Clearly in something like this, that's not the case. So we're going to have to be more choosy about the work that they do. So there'll be some work that's currently ongoing that won't be done. I need to be completely clear about that. So linked to these cases is you change the service levels. So other things you'll have seen on the list, other sort of specialist departments, if you make major cuts, we're going to have to change. Well, they currently do all of this, we're going to have to do that. And then if we drop that work, does it pass to somebody else, or do you actually say we're not going to do that now? And that does have some risks to crime and safety, but not as much as doing other cuts. And those are all the choices we've got to make. You can't. So we may not be shrinking by more than 2,000 people in an organisation, 45,000, but let's say it's still more. Still maybe it still could well be four figures. You can't do that without making some tough choices. That's just the painful reality.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
You can't, and you laughed at them getting the bus, but you know only too well, far too many safer neighbourhood teams have to get a bus to their area, which is why a meeting would not be a meeting without us mentioning the estate strategy. So there you go. Once we know where people are going to be located, I'm sure we can then start another row.
That will be published before, Chair, that will be published before the summer. We've opened recently a couple of neighbourhood bases. Kerr and I opened one in East London. Where were we? Woodford, thank you. We opened in Woodford only a few weeks ago, which was through really good, generous cooperation from the local authority there. And there are roughly, across London, I think about 90 is my recollection, I may be slightly wrong, 90 of London's 670 odd wards where the neighbourhood policing team don't have a base within a 20-minute walk of their patch. That's, in my mind, not acceptable. So we will not have the capital budget to buy bases for all of those, but in many of those places, a local authority has a housing office or some other building has got some spare space, and sort of a generous collaborative arrangement can sort it like we managed in East London. That's great. I mean, and possibly supermarkets, given the amount of theft from them, it might be nice to have some bases put in there. We did many, many years ago in Harrow, and it helped a lot with theft from shops. Sure. So that might be another idea.
If I may, you said before the summer, so summer begins in June, so we'll have it published by the end of May? Before July, before the summer break. Thank you. My team are working on it.
Commissioner, it stretches every time we ask, but we're hanging in there, aren't we, waiting for it?
I'm sure my team have an exact date, I just don't have it in my mind.
Thank you. And by the way, we'd love to take you up on the offer for looking at the finances once we know where we are. Assemblymember Garbutt.
Morning, both. And yeah, echo what the Chair said and really welcome that opportunity for further scrutiny of the budget. I wanted to zoom out slightly just around the approach taken to the budget setting. And I just wondered if absolutely everything was on the table when you were looking at your priorities for the year. Like, was it a complete review? Did you look at all options?
So everything's on the table. There's nothing that's some sort of inviolable principle that we protect. But as I said early on, we made some very clear judgments about, say, neighbourhood policing, about violence against women and girls, that actually, based on our judgment, we're not going near those. So we very quickly narrowed the scope down, which I don't think people would agree with most of those judgments in any event. But sort of that's not to say that there can't be efficiencies anywhere. There can be, but that's the judgments we've made.
And just picking up on what you said earlier, you mentioned that it was in line with your new Met for London and with the police and crime plan. So the new Met for London doesn't mention drugs at all, and the police and crime plan, the draft, talks about taking a public health approach. So I just wondered if in these conversations you looked at taking a different approach to drug policing.
So we've talked about this before, haven't we? So our policing of drugs-related issues is close to entirely focused on the link between drugs and violence. So we are focusing on organised crime and low-level crime that is about the effect of violence, and drugs is obviously often associated with that. So just as an example, our county and city lines operations, and I'll probably come into more detail under the child exploitation piece, but county and city lines operations, they are, in one sense, they're drugs operations, but in my mind, more importantly, they're reducing the level of violence amongst young people, because you're breaking drug supply networks, you're arresting the men of violence behind the networks, and it's giving you an opportunity to sort of get hold of and safeguard the sort of 14-year-old boys who are being drawn into drugs activity, and trying to get them into safeguarding arrangements with partners before they get so embedded.
And I guess it's from a budget perspective, it's looking at whether you've got that cost-effective long-term look on whether you've got that measure of success for all of those interventions.
So the measure of success is reducing violence, which we talked about earlier.
But violence has gone up in relation to the drug trade. It's well documented that it's become more and more violent the more and more it's been policed.
But I don't know where you get that stat from. The violence in London, murder rates are down, teenage murders are down, injury violence is down because of the sort of work we're doing, such as this work. So that's quite a broad comment. That's not what we're seeing as a result of the approaches we've taken.
I mean, kind of over the decades, not just over the last couple of years. But yeah, I think this is a conversation. Obviously, I've written you a letter about the evidence around drug commissioning and our just approach to drug policing. So I look forward to a response to that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Best.
Thank you. And Commissioner, I'm glad you got the chance to visit Woodford Community, the Woodford Policing Hub. That's something that I and the local MP and councillors campaigned for years, thousands and thousands and thousands of signatures. And it's taken a while, but I'm glad that it's there now.
And in the work with the local authority, and so we were discussing how to use that as a pilot for doing more across London. Sorry to cut into your opening, but I think sometimes it's quite hard for organisations to work together because local authority estates teams and technology teams have sort of like policies and they work within their tram lines, and my people do the same. And actually saying we're going to share some space and buy some space, you have to kick down all sorts of legal, procedural, health and safety, technology barriers that organisations are putting up unnecessarily, both mine and the local authority. And the work we've done with the local authority there is going to be helpful in terms of providing a framework to be able to do more of these more quickly.
Yeah, indeed, it hasn't been an easy road at all, and the local authority have made a lot of mistakes, but obviously I'm glad with the campaign that we've done and the work from the Met as well that is now finally open to replace the police station, the services and location of the police station that was there before. I wanted to just come back to the tough choices that we've got the list of, and I know you just said to Assembly Member Roberts there's no decision being made, but I just want to know, is anything off the table? Because obviously it's a scary list. We've got scaling back the ability to tackle serious crime and the size of the flying squad, cutting back on the dogs units and the horses, or mounted unit, mounted branch, and cuts the intelligence teams and forensic services, as well as obviously the Royal Parks being mentioned. Are any of those off the table?
So that's the long list. We're working through the individual planning on every single one of them. We're getting, over the next few weeks, the final details on the budgets from sort of City Hall, Home Office, etc., like I spoke earlier. And then over the next few weeks, we'll be able to make a decision. Is it that because the budget's less bad than we thought, we're doing all of those areas, but less sharply? Or is there a degree to which we're deciding not to do some of them? And obviously we've got both of those choices available, and I just need to work through the process of doing the detailed planning and seeing the numbers and get to that answer. And it's frustrating. I know it's frustrating I can't be more specific, but I'm keen to do that with you when we sit down in a few weeks, when we've done the maths and the thinking and we've got a robust answer.
Of course. I just wondered if we could categorically take anything off the table, even if we weren't giving kind of the final answers right now. The other concerning feature of this budget submission is the drawdown on the reserves and looking ahead to future years. Is there anything further that you could say about that?
So I think the Met's finances are sort of in some ways wrung dry over a long period, and this is definitely not said to criticise sort of past commissioner or past mayoral or deputy mayoral decisions. In terms of you make the best of what you've got, and in particularly difficult financial times over austerity and other periods, then having an estate that was bigger than the Met needed, had far more floor area than needed, having quite large reserves, it made sense to try and make good use of those, and people made those decisions, and I don't criticise that. But that does mean we've run out of road in terms of some of these challenges, and that creates some of the financial pressures today. And so, for example, some of those, and one of those examples now is, as you say, our reserves are at the sort of at the bottom end of safe levels, so there's no manoeuvrability there for going forward. And the second point is, because the estate sales helped maintain some of the existing estate, we do not have a budget to properly maintain our remaining estate. So one of the budget pressures for us going forward, some of it's about funding levels, some of it's about other types of pressures. We're putting about 50 million more into estates going forward, and the reason we need to do that, bear in mind our budget's sort of a bit north of 4 billion, but the reason we need to do that, it's quite a sizable amount, is my current estate's annual budget would allow for a refurbishment of every police station in London once every 120 years. If you speak to an estates expert, they'd say 20 or 25 makes sense. We've got half of our policing estate is not going to be usable within 5 years or so because of the condition it's in. So we need to start spending on that. So we've run out of runway on it, and I need to do that, and that creates that 50 million pressure as part of the bigger pressure in the system. So I just use the reserves and that as indications of people have understandably wrung everything out of any slack they've got in the system possible over 10, 15 years, and we've now hit the buffers on that, and that's why this is so particularly difficult now.
Yeah, it's scary looking at this year, but I think especially looking at next year, the pressures you've mentioned as well, national insurance rise. There's no settlement for next year, so that's another, I think, around £40 million. That's scary pressures, not only looking this year, but for next year. But with this year in mind, and I know we've already touched on this, so it may be the same answer you've given Assembly Member Roberts, but what is the latest position regarding the current number and ambition for frontline officers? Maybe the word ambition could help you.
So if I might half answer that question by going to a longer term ambition, if that's because I will have as many police officers and staff doing the best thing they can do based on the budget, and I say we've got a bit more work to do on that. As part of our spending review submission, and we can talk about this in more detail in due course, so if you bear in mind we're going to finish this year police officers high 32,000, so 32,000 and sort of, maybe 800 or 900 or something like that. I think it's about 11,000 staff. Our judgment is the Met to succeed needs to be around 38,000 officers and 19,000 staff. That ratio of 2 to 1 is the norm in other forces in the country. It's also the norm in some other parts of the world, like New York. And we've been underbalanced in that as well, which means you draw police officers into the back office rather than having the right support behind them, because there's been too much of an obsession with police numbers being the only metric of capacity. So we think we should be 38,000 and 19,000. We also need sizable increases in our estates and technology budgets to be effective. So if you look at our estates budget, to show how wrung out it is, we are spending on maintaining our properties in London half of what the Treasury spends on maintaining the Whitehall estate in London. So half per square metre. So when they ask us for efficiencies, they're spending twice as much on government estate in London as we're able to spend on policing estate, which is no wonder officers and victims and witnesses are sort of seeing pretty parlous conditions. Likewise, technology, if we were to be investing in technology comparatively to the more technology invested ends of the public sector or the median point of the private sector, we'd be spending twice as much on technology as well. So if you want a capable force going forward, either physical assets, physical buildings and technological assets, which we're massively underinvested in, and the people assets to do the best job for London. And that's the sort of thing I want to talk about in a more detailed sense when we get to meet. That's where we want to get to. At the moment, we're going in the opposite direction in size. We are starting to balance better officers and staff in terms of the decisions we're making, so we're doing some civilianisation, which is important. We are squeezing a bit of extra money into estates and technology to try and to do the first small step on what's a large escalator. But so we've got some strong views about where that takes, and that's based on a bottom-up analysis and also strategic comparisons. So, for example, New York and Sydney spend sort of close to 50% more per capita on policing than we do in London.
I guess the Mayor has put a focus on officer numbers. That was his manifesto promise. That was his big policing pledge. So I guess that's why, when we're scrutinising, that's really important for us to look at. And that number of that reduction of 2,300 frontline officers, is that something that you categorically think now we're not near that number?
Which number, sorry?
2,300. That was back in December. What we had. So
I think sort of talking about different parts, different sort of pots of money and different numbers is slightly false. And this is an obsession that the only number that matters in policing is officer numbers.
Sorry, we can also talk as well about the 400 staff
Exactly, but
if we can answer the first question, but I wanted to get to both of those elements. So you can talk about it in the round if you like.
in the round. So we do need a lot more officers, but we need more staff, we need more technology in buildings. You need a balanced organisation that's got the right skills to be able to do a great job for the public. The Mayor has put different pots of money into policing over the last few years. He's always done maximum precept, and he's often put a small number of tens of millions on top of that each year. So, but that's for him and Kaya to account for that. And so most of that money has been repeat funding. Occasionally it's been one-off funding, some of it's been repeat funding. So that's in the budget, and that's contributing to what we're doing. We don't tend to ring fence the sort of that money given that year to that 500 officers, that money that year to those 500 officers, whatever. That's not how it works. So you're picking a statement from some time ago about 2000.
What you said in December 2024 was that the budget could represent a reduction of 2,300 officers along with 400 staff. So I'm asking, are we at that position today?
No. So that was our starting assumption, and as I said earlier, the budget assumptions there were this much cut. Actually, we've got something a bit better than that from the Home Office, a bit better than that potentially from City Hall. The details still being finalised. So we will still be seeing a significant cut, but it won't be as deep as we first thought. But the details are going to take a few weeks to get the final financial details, and a few weeks to do the final planning details to get to the answer.
But we'll definitely be losing officers and staff next year.
Yes. I haven't seen anything to suggest that that's not the case.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember Roberts.
Thank you. And again, this is for the Commissioner. It's following on from Assemblymember Best. At the last committee, I repeatedly encouraged the Deputy Mayor to say whether she was able to deliver on the mayoral pledge for 1,300 extra. Let me see. I'll read this out precisely. Neighbourhood police officers and PCSOs on the streets. Now, I appreciate that's a politician's pledge. But with your operational insights, do you think that we will see an additional 1,300 extra? So that would be on the top of what we had at the beginning of the mayoral term, delivered by the end of the mayoral term, which is when the pledge is to be delivered by.
I don't know the baseline for that, so I can't answer that question. What I can say is that
if I can be of assistance, the baseline would be May 2024. The number of PCSOs and police officers would we see an additional, keeping that as a baseline, and that number plus 1,300 by May 2028.
That's clearly possible. It would require a check, but it's clearly
possible or likely is more the question.
Well, we're going to have a spending review, aren't we? So government may decide to invest significantly in policing, or it may not. So you're asking me to guess what a government and a mayor are going to do financially over the next 3 years, which I don't think I can really do.
That's fair enough.
But what I would say, though, you've heard me talk in terms of my responsibility, you've heard me talk many times about the significance of neighbourhood policing. It's the foundation of policing. It's the foundation of trust. And as I was talking about the engage point earlier on, even though we've been in a shrinking organisation, we have tilted resources in two directions. We've tilted more resources into neighbourhoods and more into public protection. The number we've tilted into neighbourhoods is an additional 500 or so people. That's all the way from leaders. So I've had lots of positive comments from all 32 leaders, of which you're one, about actually the strengthening of local leadership with the local superintendents and their teams has made a big difference, all the way through to the extra officers on the ground and extra PCSOs on the ground, and City Hall and myself share enthusiasm for trying to grow PCSO numbers. I'd both like to grow them back closer to where they were sort of 15 years ago, before neighbour policing started being cut. So we've tilted as much as we can within our existing resources towards it, and both the Home Secretary and the Mayor and sort of share that same ambition that neighbour policing is an important part of the future.
Yep, I agree entirely on the PCSOs, particularly as Richmond had 2 British Empire medals awarded to our PCSOs by the King recently. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to have to pick up speed, colleagues. Assemblymember Duval.
Thank you very much. You mentioned spending review. We've talked about it in the past. clearly no one ever gets, over all my years sitting around this table, have we ever got what we've ever asked for, the full amount, and things move, numbers move from, you know, in terms of officer numbers, in terms of the budget that you've been given. The real issue for the spending review, it seems to me, is how far and the capacity to talk to the real decision makers over our finances about flexibility. The flexibility to deliver on crime outcomes, but not in a way that they've dealt with in the past. If we have more of the same, then I think we are going to be always in this problem of never quite getting where we need to be with the Metropolitan Police Service. You said it, 3 things: people, technology, and the capacity, the estate capacity to deliver around that. And my view is, how far do you think the narrative in talking to those decision makers, can we get onto that flexibility issue if we're to achieve the better policing outcomes and what most people want around this table, and what you want to deliver and what the Mayor wants to deliver in terms of Londoners? Is the government mature enough to understand that we can still deliver, but maybe not in the straitjackets of the budget making or the budget processes or comprehensive spending reviews that they've done in the past? I recognise they have given support. I've recognised that. More so in terms of the last 14 years, but it's never going to be quite enough for us to change the way the Metropolitan Police does its business. So what's your thinking about that?
So I agree with the general tenor of the question. This is ideally what we need. The more you can remove some of the straitjackets, some of the guardrails that reduce efficiency, take extra cost, create an ineffective organisation, arguably the less of that you need, or the more you can achieve, the more you can achieve with it. And so one example of that would be the sort of the obsession with ring fencing of funding into little pots, and that creates tensions and barriers. We've engaged in, between policing and all the main parties, we've engaged in a pretense that the convenient thing is to talk about police officer numbers is the only thing that matters. I mean, the logical extraction of that is actually you end up with, let's just have police officers. We won't train them. We won't have any support staff. We won't have any buildings or technology. I know that's ridiculous, but that's almost what the implication is, the way we talk about it so obsessively. And that's not to say police officers aren't, I would like more police officers, but I want them properly supported and properly equipped and properly trained, and you get the right balance. And a phrase that I've used that the Mayor's sort of used as well a few times sort of more recently is about the Met being out of shape. One of the reasons we ended up being engaged was being out of shape, that balance of different types of resources was so out. So that's one issue, but there are other factors. There are the criminal justice system has got far more bureaucratic and slow over I mean, it's got clogged, and it's really in a parlous situation now, but it's got more bureaucratic and slow over many, many, many years. That has massive cost on policing and reduced the number of cases we can solve. If you could free that up, and there's a Brian Leveson, former Court of Appeal judge, is doing a view on that now, and that could massively increase what we can achieve with the same resources. When you look at sort of our ability to employ, motivate and reward people, the way police regulations work, we've had a narrow conversation on police regulations earlier in terms of dealing with vetting issues, but there's wider issues about how you employ and develop people. So there are many guardrails around policing that create a straitjacket, which means I am absolutely determined, as are all the men and women I'm privileged to work with, we will do everything we can do to make progress. But we're within these boundaries. The more we can move those boundaries, and as you're right, not all of them are money, some of them are policy, some of them are law, the more we can move those boundaries, the more opportunity we've got to succeed for communities.
And can you just confirm, there's nothing new in terms of this conversation that we're having? Some of it has been in the public domain for some time about what might need to change.
Yes.
Equally, with removing the straitjackets, but also you still have accountability in a different way in terms of delivering, in terms of focusing on those policing outcomes. So I'll go back to the original question. How far do you think the debate is with new government that they are willing to take a risk, but the risk is minimal, that where there could be a new way of working, a new way of delivering policing here in London, or for the rest of the country, I don't mind which, but I'm more interested about what happens here in London in terms of delivering that service for Londoners.
So we've started the conversation with the new government. I think the politics of this is really difficult. So if I can speak just as a police officer, if this is the wrong way around, really commenting on politicians, but sort of privately, lots of politicians say to me, politicians of all political hues, this is a slightly ridiculous thing we've got ourselves into. We're pretending policing is about one input rather than about what it delivers for communities. But you all feel stuck that that's become the political debate, and you don't know how to get off that conveyor belt. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to have a serious conversation with you all about not this year's budget, but going forward. If we could have a consensus in London on actually, let's have the best equipped, best balanced organisation that's going to do a great job for London communities, and let's hold the Commissioner and his or her team to account on what they deliver rather than trying to micromanage the inputs. If we had a consensus here on that, then that would be quite powerful, wouldn't it? But I think it's going to take some reaching across sort of operational and political and across political aisles if we were to get anywhere near that.
Thank you. Chair, can I just ask you, one of the things that I think we do need when we come together is to understand how you've achieved your financial savings in previous years and what's the lessons being learned. And if we could have that in that discussion, I don't want to bounce you into that now, but it might be very important as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, one of the important things, Commissioner, is that you do send officers to us for us to scrutinise. We can't have a conversation with you with the greatest respect, as in you, the police force, if we don't have officers here to answer our questions, because they are important questions. They come from all sides of the political sphere. We vehemently disagree with each other on many things, but we put the questions to police officers, and we would be so grateful if you would start sending officers back to answer our questions in the future.
Can I politely disagree with you slightly, Chair? We've sent some very senior staff who are part of my board who are leading on big complex issues, who've got detailed understanding of aspects of policing, and for the sessions they're turning up for, they're more than capable of dealing with it. And I think they should be seen as senior leaders. And the diversity within our senior team, that includes people with HR, finance, strategy, legal, communications sort of expertise, is as important as people like me who've got policing expertise.
No, we're not in disagreement at all, actually, and I'm quite happy to disagree with anybody, and I do frequently. No, what we are disagreeing about is the question and answer sessions. When you send a specialist on a specific issue, they are brilliant, and they show the worth of us having somebody from the Metropolitan Police here. When we don't have any on a session like this where we're asking lots of different questions, that's when the issue arises. So I would again respectfully say, please send somebody. You don't have to come yourself. Your deputy we've only ever seen once. We'd be very grateful. It's the question and answer sessions that our deputy mayor cannot answer the questions because they're operational. So perhaps if you could bear that in mind. The ones you do send are brilliant, which is why we'd like more of it, please. Right, we're very quickly, a couple of questions now. Why is the funding for the delivery of a new Met for London less than anticipated when the budget was originally set?
We've, as part of making choices, we've trimmed our ambitions on reform. That's the reality. So Emma and I think Zoe both were asking earlier in terms of was there anything off the table? So when we looked across the board, we're protecting these areas. We decided we weren't going to compromise on the idea that we need to reform and improve, and we need to invest to do that improvement. And we haven't compromised on the principle, but we have compromised on the quantum because we've got budget pressures, and that's a difficult reality.
Yeah, and we heard yesterday, some of us, just some of the excellent work going on in that. And I just note that there's £32 million less, yes. Which is a great shame because of the amount of work that's going on there. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Commissioner. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Commissioner, The Home Secretary recently added £65 million to the National and International Capital Cities grant, which was a significant increase on the previous government's contribution. What input will the additional £65 million have on public order policing?
Helpfully, the Home Secretary hasn't ring-fenced that. So I think the way to see this is most police forces get money from two broad pots. There's the government grant, and there's the local council tax from the local mayor or police and crime commissioner. There's a third pot which the Met and the City of London, to a smaller degree, get, which is the Capital Cities grant, which is trying to capture those special issues. But it's not a ring-fence pot. That award was one of the things that I said earlier on. Our original budget assumptions were exceeded by the original government statement by 45 million. That 65 million was one of the things that helped contribute towards that, so it made us 45 million better off. But it's not ring-fenced separately, so whilst it's more generously anticipated, it's still part of a budget where we're anticipating having to cut resources. So there's not something ring-fenced to go to protest activity or anything like that. It will overall help us shrink by less, but it doesn't give us a ring-fence pot to put into something like protest policing, which actually, having it ring-fenced would be unhelpful for the reasons I've articulated previously.
Thank you for clarifying that. You have been, well, there's been an announcement by government for £200 million for neighbourhood policing. I'm assuming that is ring-fenced, and how will that be prioritised by the Met?
So we were confident of 100 million for policing, and it became 200 million only 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago? Yeah, 2 weeks ago, possibly. Our share of that, of each 100 million, is about 22.8, I think is my memory, so that makes 45.6 between the two. We're still working with the Home Office to understand exactly the strings attached, because obviously it's one of those ring-fence grants that they want it spent on neighbourhood policing. Given we have ambitions on neighbourhood policing, that could be really helpful, but also the ring-fencing could trip us up, and the exact rules make quite a big difference on how you can use it. So we're working our way through that, but in principle, of course, more money and aligned to our priorities is welcome.
Do you have an estimate of when we will know a bit more about this?
So I was talking to Deputy Commissioner just on the way here today, and sort of we're in advanced conversations with the Home Office, understanding the rules they're setting, and those officials are moving quickly. So it's a bit confusing, but we're getting there. So hopefully we'll have clarity soon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Actually, as Assembly Member Ahmed has brought up public order, if we think about the £53 million cost of policing the pro-Palestinian protests, and the effect that must have on the front line. Last month we saw protesters publicly stating their intention to ignore police conditions, and the footage of thousands of people forcibly pushing their way past police lines, and that's been particularly undermining for the Met's deterrent. What action will you be taking to ensure that protesters are not emboldened to take on the Met via force again?
So our policing of protest over the last 2 years has been highly scrutinised and massively contentious. I mean, there have been two big themes in that, haven't there? There's been the sort of environmental protest big themes with blocking roads and throwing paint at artworks and that sort of behaviour, and trying to close down motorways near Heathrow. And then the second theme has been the protest that spin out of the terrorist attack and the conflict that's followed in the Middle East. Those are divisive issues in a society that's ever more polarised and sort of angry with what's on social media. We stand in the middle, sort of policing under the law without fear or favour. Parliament creates the law, and if people don't think the protest laws are balanced in the right way, that's for them to sort it with Parliament, not with us. It concerns me the degree of sort of partisan political comment on individual protest activity. that particular Saturday, our command team took a judgment that the original protest plans of the PSC and other bodies were too disruptive because they were going to start very close to the central synagogue, and that was unreasonable given that was a day of prayer. It wasn't a Monday, Tuesday or Wednesday or a Sunday, it was a day of prayer. We'd probably make a similar decision if a sort of hard right group wanted to protest near a mosque on a Friday. Yet because of sort of partisan political reasons, all of a sudden there's outrage and lots of parliamentarians and politicians writing letters. This is about balance and policing operating without fear or favour, and it would be helpful if politicians on the extremes of both sides of the debate didn't sort of didn't leap in to criticise from a partisan perspective and appreciated the police are wrestling with complex issues and trying to find balance under the law.
I think they're between a rock and a hard place sometimes. If you're very quick, we're really running late now.
I just want to correct that I don't think there was any videos of people forcing through the line. They're all very peaceful. If you can share the video you've seen of people forcing through.
I will.
I've only seen people walking through. And just to
Can we just say
clarify,
on that, though, there are people who've been interviewed and bailed, and there may or may not be prosecutions in the future, so I'm not going to take part in the debate on that.
Okay.
I just wanted to clarify that the PSC were giving, back in November the 30th when they wanted to protest outside.
Okay.
I just want to clarify something.
Okay.
I just think that but the misinformation has been presented.
This is not a place to do that. You're wasting our time.
Committee, stop, please. We're going
The police did say that they could protest at the BBC at their next protest in January.
Enough. Right, we're going to move on to grooming gangs and child sexual exploitation. We'll start with Assembly Member Bailey, please.
Good morning to you both. I'm just going to start with the Commissioner, a sort of broad question. Are you confident that the Met understands the scale of sexual exploitation in London, given that the HMICRFS report that was published in February 2004 cited some very serious problems around the Met's capacity and understanding and capturing of statistics and all this?
Lord Bailey, thank you very much for the question. I'm confident that we've got as good an understanding as we can do, and we're working desperately hard on it. Of course, it's a hidden crime. It's not fully reported. It's hard to see. But we made immense progress since that report, and that was one of the themes that the theme around sort of sexual exploitation and related matters was something that had been on the HMIC's radar since, I'm going to say roughly about 2020, but certainly for several years. It's one of the themes of us being engaged, and it's one of the issues that they've seen great progress on, which is why they've taken us out of those special measures. In terms of trying to sort of lay down the picture, the exploitation of children, and it's worth just spending a few minutes just framing this, the exploitation of children doesn't lend itself to simple classification. It's not like crime types. You can say, well, that was a shoplifting, that was a theft of a vehicle, that was a robbery, a street robbery of a phone. If people are being exploited, they are often exploited for multiple purposes, and exploiters often have multiple motives. So looking across the themes of exploitation around criminal exploitation, e.g. drawing kids into gangs to run drugs for you, sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, so exploiting people in the household, wider labour exploitation, and people trafficking. Those are the 5 categories we use, but there's massive overlaps, and you'll often find individuals exploited across 2 or 3 of those, and exploiters, the offenders, operating across 2 or 3 of those. But the rough balance between them, in terms of the exploitation of children in London, it's around 3/5, around 60% probably is the main issue is criminal exploitation. Maybe a bit less than a fifth is sexual. Around a tenth is domestic servitude. Around a tenth is labour exploitation, and maybe about 4 or 5% is trafficking. I'm being deliberately sort of cautious about giving exact percentages because it's not an exact science, but I'm trying to give you a sense of the balance to understand this. So in terms of the way we deal with exploitation, we're very much trying to deal with it in the round rather than pigeonhole it into particular narrow subjects, because it doesn't lend itself to that very readily, and then you miss the point of dealing with the individual, both from the victim perspective, the person who's been exploited, and also the offender in terms of those exploited it. Our approach has been very focused on, so how do you spot this, your radar to spot it? So you need officers highly attuned to spot the signs of this with, you know, a child who goes missing. Is it angry running away from something in a sort of a moment, or are they being drawn towards something else and exploited? The gangs and drugs issues, who are the sort of lead offenders and architects, and who are the exploited? Sometimes it's the same person. The 16-year-old who's been exploited into gangs is now exploiting younger kids. You get all of this complexity. Some of the sexual exploitation is child on child. It's very complex. It's one of the growing areas of sexual offending, and certainly the balance in London, we see, given, I'm sure this conversation will touch on some of the national inquiries and some of the other work and some of the profile of that, the balance in London is very, very tipped towards the criminal exploitation. It's the biggest exploitation issue we're worried about is the gangs, drugs gangs, street gangs, doing the county lines, etc. Some of them are getting involved in the phone robberies, and they're exploiting sort of 12, 13, 14-year-old boys, often boys from black communities who are drawn into this, and then they become the exploiters of tomorrow. And that's the biggest challenge that we're seeing, not to sort of diminish that there is, of course, sexual exploitation, sometimes in that context, sometimes other contexts, particularly with children who are sort of missing on repeat occasions and are being exploited by others. For example, last year we had 8,000 reports of missing children. More than a third of those had been reported missing more than once, up to the most extreme, one child missing 60 times. So there's something sort of really out of control there, and there's obviously that a child in that situation is clearly going to be massively vulnerable and at risk of exploitation. So it's that range of issues we're dealing with, and we're regularly making arrests across offences, so sexual offending, so drugs networks, breaking up those things, putting the children who are being exploited into touch with local authorities and charities, etc., to do the safeguarding work while we do the prosecution work. We're sort of making arrests for modern slavery offences, drugs offences, exploitation offences. So it's a broad and complex picture. And the public debate on the back of some horrific cases has focused on one narrow type and dimension of it that's happened in a few towns scattered across the country. I think if we have a conversation about it, it's worth seeing it in the round.
I partially agree with what you say. Let's be clear, it was in over 50 places over the country, so it wasn't a few places in the country, it was over 50. And that's the point, isn't it? Many of those places didn't know it was happening and would have done something if they knew. And the challenge we have in London, the Met started in quite a weak place with its child protection issues. It has made great progress. I'll accept that. But the reason people are focused on sexual exploitation gangs is because a gang focused on a very particular piece of work has ways of hiding itself. And why what's happened in the rest of the country is very relevant is because it was a failing on the part of a number of agencies. That's the difference. Your drug dealing gang is not involved. The council are not involved in that, whereas these gangs, it looked like they were. My major worry for us here in London.
To correct you on that, sorry, Sean, but the council are involved in the drugs gangs work because some of those children involved in those gangs are children in care of local authorities, for example. So we all have a role to play.
Sorry, let me go. When I say involved, people who are actual councils, etc., were implicated. Is the point I'm trying to make. The challenge in London is we have a an abundance of a particular type of child exploitation. Certainly I'd recognise from my community, county lines, those kind of things. And you're correct, there is a drug dealer doesn't say, oh, we'll just do drugs. They'll do anything illegal that generates money. I accept that. Why does sexual exploitation driven by gangs of adults is important? Because in London, we just wanted to see if we have that problem. So the government's refusal to do a national inquiry is a real shame. But what I'm worried about in London, because we know largely where our biggest problem lies, street gangs, exploitation, mainly down the drug route, county lines, is that blinding us to other things that are happening? That's my first question. Are we very sure that we don't have a significant problem around child sexual exploitation gangs?
So I can't guarantee.
I'm not asking for a guarantee.
No, I know you're not. So I can't guarantee there's something that out there that we haven't seen.
Right.
Are we doing everything we possibly can do? Teams are working extraordinarily hard. We've done a lot of work with all of our frontline officers to understand the complex nuances behind this, to deal with issues of potentially victim-blaming language and being sort of blinkered. It's just a regular runaway, as opposed to no. That's immediately putting yourself in a mindset that it's the problems with the child rather than something around the child. So we've dealt with that. That's one of the things HMRC have commented really positive on. Our reports of exploitation are going up rapidly, of children at risk of exploitation. I see every morning we have an operational log, which is last 24 hours, which has sort of a range of things like serious crimes, serious injuries to police officers, and amongst that are sort of high-risk misbehs. And I see every day sort of multiple cases where they're being followed through because there's a 15-year-old, 13-year-old who's missing from where they ought to be, and all the signs point to that being sort of a risk of exploitation, and those are followed through with that open-mindedly by ourselves, say working with local authorities and children's services. And there's also increasing schemes we're trying to do with other businesses and areas, like to try and help others help us spot children at risk of exploitation, because we're not a children's agency, we're not everywhere, every place, every time. And so we need as many sort of eyes out there as possible. And whilst those in sort of education, local authorities will be attuned to it, for example, I saw a report about doing some work with one of the shopping centres in London, because that's where kids looking for somewhere warm who are sort of vulnerable might sort of hang around there, and asking them to think about what the signs might be and for them to report. So trying to find different ways, because the more we can increase our radar, the more reduce the risk, which is behind your question. That we spot something.
I personally feel that the Met has improved greatly around this area, but my other area of concern arising from the report, and again why this government should have done a national inquiry, is the number of agencies, particularly police officers, who felt they couldn't report something because they were going to be accused of being racist or whatever. That's a real problem. If the police actually cannot operate without fear or favour, that's a real problem for us all. Are you confident that within the Met, that a Met officer would be able to say something if a black person or an Indian person or any other person was involved in a way that seemed to be a problem in other parts of the country?
I think we've shown, it goes back to the protest point earlier, I think we've shown from top to bottom of the organisation that regardless of the sort of stones and challenges thrown around us, we will do everything we can do to operate without fear or favour, and we'll step into difficult space on all sorts of cases, and that's on this. I think that's important. That's a top to the bottom issue, because frontline officers need that confidence. So I see lots of examples of that every day, and I don't see examples of if I was to look at our mistakes over recent years, I can see lots of reasons behind them in terms of training or skills or attitude. I don't see evidence that any of them have been primarily caused by a fear of acting because I can't do it because that suspect is such and such an ethnicity. I don't see, not in child protection cases, I don't see any evidence of that. it's not impossible, but there's nothing systematic out there.
So you feel like you as a senior officer team, the politicians around that, I know you can't answer for the politicians, I wouldn't expect you to, the press, you feel like your officers feel defended enough, supported enough that they could make a complaint, take something forward and not worry about how it might look?
I mean, I think I'm confident they feel like this on this issues. I think when we come to the stop and search conversation, officers' confidence
I'll
to
be
act.
back for that, don't worry.
I think that's a slightly different tipping point.
Yes, it is.
But I think on this issue, PC Rowley is dealing with an allegation that X is exploiting or abusing child Y, and there may be sort of racial complexities and sort of issues of sensitivity in that. I don't see evidence they're going to be afraid to deal with that.
Okay, thank you. One tiny little question. We had confirmation from the Met that when it comes to child exploitation, there's been a serious increase, a 56% increase since September 24 in the amount of cases that have been reported and that you're following. Why is that? Is that because you're better at finding them? Are you working better with partners, or has there been a spike in activity?
It's definitely largely and possibly entirely better at finding it. So being more attuned to it. So my point, for example, about how we deal with missing young people, and sort of being much more open to and deliberate about looking for the risk of exploitation rather than assuming it's about somebody who just runs away regularly, because that's a dangerous sort of inadvertent sort of bias. So dealing with those sorts of issues, calling out that risk. We recognised also our risk assessment process was too geared to managing down demand, and we weren't classifying enough as high risk, and that's changed as well. So there's been quite a few changes in process that we've been doing as part of our own efforts to improve, and that's what's given the HMRC very great confidence in what we're doing. And because of those demands, when I talked earlier about, say, we put over 500 extra officers into the public protection area, dealing with rape and sexual abuse, etc. A big chunk of those people have gone into this area because we've got to do a better job, and we've got more demand that we've been suppressing, and we need to have the resources there to do it properly.
Your officers should be commended on the improvements they're making in this area, and I'll have to just keep going. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sean.
I agree, but privately, officers will tell you they are frightened of being called racist, and that I know that. I'm just saying, in general, they are. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, I've been reading with great interest the MPS's children's strategy, and actually was very excited when the element of child first and putting children first within our policies was absolutely, clear and defined. What I'd like to know is, how is the Met supporting officers and other relevant staff in identifying child exploitation, and then, what happens next?
Yeah, thank you. We are the first police force in the country to have a children's strategy that uses the child-first approach, which is widely used in children's services and elsewhere. It is a more tricky concept for policing, and I think it's worth explaining why I say that. Because we have our enforcement duties as well as our safeguarding duties, we are uniquely in a position, because we have two sets of duties. The law says children over the age of 10 are criminally responsible. The law also says that children should be, all safeguarding agencies, including policing, should have a view to the safeguarding and the protection of children. That's a difficult balance. If you're a children's services, you're much more focused on one half of that equation. We've got to do both of those. And in the opening to the strategy, I talked there about dealing with the balance between a 13-year-old being exploited and forced to transport drugs, compared with dealing with an 8-year-old growing up maybe in a household of domestic violence, or a violent 17-year-old with a knife, where an officer is going to be using force and sort of coercive powers potentially. The idea of child first in that very messy context for police officers is difficult, and that's why my forward I call that out, and our approach we call it out. Because if if it comes across to officers as child first means you don't do enforcement activity against children, that's not acceptable. But likewise, if you really want to overuse it and miss the dimensions of children who are vulnerable. So that's why we've called it out, but we're really proud of it. So our new Met for London training is we're giving sort of all officers a week's training, or all frontline people a week's training, officers and staff. The first half has been focused on the values and the principles of the Met, and brought to life then by looking at particular issues such as stop and search and victim, sort of quality of service to victims. That's 33,000 people who are the most junior grades in the organisation, officers and staff. We are well over halfway through that, and that should be finished by sort of April time. And then the second part, which will sort of flow on the back of the rest of the year, will be for 22,000 officers and staff who have contact with the public, so like police officers, PCSOs, call handlers, detention officers. And that will dive further into dealing with some of the more sort of complex issues, including dealing with children and some of the other areas around public protection. So we're doing to do a programme of this scale of investment in leadership and training is enormous. We're on our second run through of all frontline leaders, so all sergeants and equivalents getting a 1-week course. They had one last year, they're doing another week this year, which is picking up a lot of these issues. So the reason we're making progress is supervisors have already had training and they're helping make this stick. And then we're doing leadership development for mid and senior line leaders, because one of the things that got killed off in the last 15 years was investment in leadership and development. And again, it all goes to the point about, if you want a successful organisation, you want the right balance of people, you want people well trained and equipped, and this is part of that balance that comes from New Met for London. So we've got a mechanism to build that skill set, and we've got the experts at the centre of the sort of the work on child exploitation and child first to drive it through and to monitor the success.
How are you going to evaluate that training? How are you going to know that it's worked?
It's not sort of documents we're sort of going to publicise in detail, but we've got evaluation sheets, we've got a whole evaluation approach which shows the success of the training. I'm really proud of my training team. They've done a fantastic job, because these are complex issues. It's not like learning a bit of law. This is really complex, tricky stuff. And the way they've approached the training, they've designed the course, lots of external expertise and input. They've got constant evaluation, and what we've seen with all the training we've been doing over the last couple of years is they start off fairly positive, the evaluations, and as they mature, they get more and more positive, because we're learning what worked in the training, what didn't, and improving it. And so I'm confident they've built a delivery model because of that agility, which means we can have the effect. Because when you're tackling issues that go to subtle judgments, culture, things that are stretching for any of us, you need a very agile, thoughtful approach to training. You're not just cramming in technical knowledge, and so the team are doing it really well.
Thank you, and thank you for outlining the difficulties and getting the balance right as well. I think a lot of times people don't realise how difficult that is, and I'm grateful for you actually publicly saying that. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Assemblymember Duval.
Thank you, Chair. You may have answered this earlier on, but just for clarity in terms of our evidence gathering, the inspectors reported that senior leaders in the Met have not recently commissioned force-wise analysis in relation to child exploitation because the results would be inaccurate or have important information missing. You clearly, in your earlier answer, you've been thinking about this. Yeah. Can you just take us a little bit more about, okay, so if we can't have X, will we have Y? What's your thinking? How far do you think your conversation with the Inspectorate is going? Because clearly they would like you to do something, but clearly if they'd like you to do something, they would be saying this is how you should do it, but no doubt you'll tell us. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so that sort of, I think that's from the sort of report where we were very criticised not that long ago, but that's a year ago now. We've moved on a long way. We've come out of, so we've had a much cleaner bill of health since then. I think if you look back, what caused that? If you don't have enough people in that world, they're overloaded with cases. You suppress demand by downgrading risk on cases, so you're misreporting it. So your data that then feeding into your analysis is weaker. So your the lack of investment, lack of attention, the stretch is suppressing the picture. No one's doing that maliciously. People are just wrestling with sort of with the load in the system. Being really clear, and this is why I keep coming back to the new Met for London plan. It's not simply a plan about making sort of managerial changes. It's about priorities and strategy. Being really clear in that, say the significance of neighbourhood policing I've mentioned, and the Borg and public protection areas, that has driven us putting more resources into it. It's driven doing all the policy work. So it's driven having the resources to cope and doing the thinking to start to get the processes and the reporting right, and then doing the training like I've just spoken about with the last question. And then you start to draw through more reporting, you have better data, and you're able to do the sort of analysis which I sort of summarised with the first question, I think, when Sean Bailey opened it. So that's the progress we've made. This is always going to be something which is partly hidden, where if you've got a vulnerable individual who may also be committing offences and has had some sort of enforcement encounters with police, they might not be reporting that besides being out stealing, they're also being sexually exploited. There's all sorts of complexities with that, so that might not get reported to us. There's going to be things that we miss, but we're opening our radar as widely as we can do and working with others like local authorities, like private sector businesses. Please, we need as much information as possible to scoop this in to get the best view we can do and spot the risks. But the analysis I gave earlier reflects our current picture, and I think the team have been really thoughtful on it, and the mix across those different dimensions of exploitation.
Almost sounds a modern version of the old-fashioned duty room in the police station, which collected all the information that went on the previous day and see if there were connections with other issues. So it's the modern version of that. It's
a sort of modern data-led version of that, because once upon a time, when policing was more local, people could know about everything. As communities become more transient and more complex, you need systems to help you join that together, because the child who's missing from that borough is being exploited on that borough, is dossing down with friends over here, is committing crime in Westminster, sort of stealing phones or whatever. So unless you join it all together, you're not getting the full picture of that sort of regular missing child who's committing crime and being exploited. It's really, really complex. And maybe then you speak to the local authority and it turns out they're having sort of difficult decisions to make about sort of them and their home environment, and they're out of school or they're in a pupil referral unit. You get all of that messiness, and it takes a lot of joining it together, and it's a difficult job for policing alone, let alone the work with partners. But that's what we're improving. And I've been meeting over the last sort of 18 months with the 3 or 4 sort of leads for the 32 boroughs in terms of youth services across London as part of us resetting our approach, and they've been really encouraging and supportive, and we've been looking at this and other areas such as how do we use stop and search as an indicator of exploitation, in the sense of if a child has been regularly stop and searched, say a 15-year-old who's hanging around with gang members, the stop and search is, are you carrying some drugs or a weapon today? But the follow-through is, if that's happening regularly, what do we do about the fact there's a warning here that this 15-year-old is making some bad life choices, and before they end up carrying weapons or arrested for drugs, how do we work with local authorities to give them the opportunity to try and rescue them? So all of these complex issues where I don't pretend we've got a perfect solution, but we're making good progress.
Okay, let's turn to the recommendations made by the Inspectorate concerning child exploitations. Have they been fully implemented now or adopted by the MPS, or are you in discussion on some of those recommendations?
So I can't remember the full list, but in terms of the work with the Inspectorate, they gave us, there were multiple comments, there were some recommendations, but at the top of it, they had 3 causes for concern, which is those are the headlines for these are the 3 serious reasons that you're engaged in relation to this issue, and they've discharged all 3 of those. So they're happy that we've made really good progress on all of those. Though, of course, within their comments and detail, I'm saying we're not perfect. There'll be things we're doing, but in terms of the big headline concerns, they're dealt with.
Maybe we could have some written communication from you about some of those other issues.
Yep.
Of where they are, so we can keep track of it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. In the interest of time, colleagues, I won't ask my question, so we'll go straight to Assemblymember Baker.
Thanks, Chair. I want to return to the Met's Children's Strategy briefly, and I wanted to ask you, Deputy Mayor, what's your assessment of progress made, and do we have an implementation plan and delivery group finalised?
Thank you. I mean, I think we've outlined in the strategy how important this approach is, and it's been, I think, in after being published in action for 6 months now, and we've regularly look at how the implementation's going. Obviously, the Commissioner's talked a lot about how the engage process. That's something that the Mayor, was really concerned about. So, tying all of these things together, we, MOPAC, regularly evaluate the work that's happening. We look at, we've recently taken on the responsibility for appropriate adults, so that's another way in which we can have oversight in this particular area. Also, we are working with the police regularly on through our criminal justice system work to make sure that at every having youth practitioners in custody suites, having training for solicitors on having a child first approach. So we're making sure as the Mayor's Office of Police and Crime that we are taking a kind of ecology approach to making sure that in every area that a child comes in contact with the criminal justice service, that we're doing our best to embed the real core and important elements of the child strategy.
Okay. Just to specifically on the second part of that, is an implementation plan coming? Is that something that there is going to be in a delivery group? Is that on its way?
Yeah, the team have a sort of plan about implementation. They also have sort of success measures, and they're working their way through that.
Yeah. Is that something that's going to be shared with us, or is that something internal?
I think it's an internal document.
Okay. All right, then. The Commissioner, just to come to you, so what progress specifically has been made on the revision of the London Child Exploitation Operating Protocol? That was one of the things in the
This is one of the things
in the strategy.
So this is one of the things in the strategy, and I've got the answer somewhere in here. He said, playing for time.
Chair,
Thank you.
While the Commissioner is looking up on
No
that,
worries.
can I, just on this topic overall, I think it's really important to highlight the wider work that the Mayor's Office and Police and Crime Plan is doing to support victim survivors of child sexual exploitation. Obviously, the Commissioner's laid out, the context in which we're working on the work we do through the Violence Reduction Unit to support exploited children or children at risk of exploitation in prevention is key in this. Also, the work that the Mayor commissions through the Lighthouse charity, which is nationally recognised by the Children's Commissioner as excellent. He set that funding, set that up. It supports children who have been sexually exploited. It's really also important. That's 1,600 survivors who've been through that service. So I think we really need to recognise the voluntary sector work that's been done in that. And also every year, the £650,000 that go into the emotional support service for exploited children or children who have sadly been sexually abused. So I think it's just really important to recognise that the Met is obviously doing an amazing job in child protection, and I had the honour of going to Holborn and seeing their child abuse team there. But we are also working in prevention and support for victims as well.
Thanks, that's helpful.
I still haven't found my note.
Okay, I suspect, Chair, can we get the answer in writing?
I'm annoyed with myself because I read it last night, and
it was there.
So we have been working with sort of local authorities and the partners on the protocol about how we work together.
Yeah.
It's a sort of Met sort of document, but it's very much a joint piece of work. And it reflects that point I was making earlier about how we work together on these difficult issues, like children identified as vulnerable through stop and search, for example, and many other factors. So it covers all of that, and it's very much work in progress. And it's a part of making the point alongside the work I mentioned with the business community, which is Operation Make Safe, about how we work with others to have the right network to both spot and then help children.
Thanks. Yeah, if you could finally come back to us. I was actually going to ask about Operation Make Safe as well. So since you've mentioned it, because it seems very, very important, very valuable bit of work in terms of making sure businesses are aware and sort of have their eye out. Didn't seem to be any sort of success measures in terms of how successful it actually is being. I think there's some numbers in terms of reporting and stuff like that. But is there anything more that you'd have in terms of is it delivering effectively, or is there more that could be done in that area?
So I haven't yet seen sort of a detailed evaluation. So we're reaching out. We've got some shopping centres involved with it. Other smaller venues like sort of the young people risk of exploitation might hang around, like vape shops, chicken shops, sort of other sorts of venues. So we're doing that briefing. I would expect it to start to deliver more reporting. And I think sort of these are preventative awareness issues. They're very hard to get exact value out of. But if I gave you a parallel, in terms of protecting sort of women, particularly young women in the nighttime economy, the Ask for Angela scheme, which has all been about raising the awareness of nightclubs and pubs and bars to the risk of women being preyed upon in pubs and the spiking issues, and the Ask for Angela code, the adoption of that sort of thing across many of the sort of most of the nighttime economies has been quite powerful. It provides extra sort of confidence to women in those contexts, and we do have a number of cases where women have sort of activated that, so to speak, and gone to door staff or bar staff and used that. So I think the results are partly about confidence and the ability of a community to be strong, as well as they are about the tactical value of them.
Yeah. No, understood. It would be good to see when you do have some sort of outputs on that. And finally, just very specifically, I was going to ask about the specific commitment to undertake training in childhood vulnerability. I wonder, is that part of the training programme that you were talking us through before, or is that separate? Because you've already told us that's sort of halfway through. It
is part of that. We've done some, say, with the leaders training, and it's most of it for the 22,000 people who have day-to-day contact, officers and staff. It will be in this second phase after Easter. But we've already seen the uptick because of some of the briefings and some of the work done. We've done some training with specialists. The victim blaming language training, for example, victim blaming language sort of avoidance training, if you like, was done with supervisors and briefings across the organisation. So we've done bits. What we found with doing a major reset in multiple ways, as the new Met London strategy requires, and the getting out of engage, you're in it with so many strands of work, and many of them have small training requirements, that if you did them all separately, it would tie the whole organisation in knots, because people would be vanishing for half a day on this and a day on that all over the place. So we decided, actually, let's just make a strategic intent. We're going to invest a week's training in everybody over the course of a year, and we're going to get as much of this in there as possible, and that because there are overlapping issues, it makes sense. And we decided to break it into two halves. The first half being every every junior person, PCs or staff, and that's 33,000. And then the second part is the 22,000 who have public contacts, call handlers, detention officers, constables, detectives, etc., and that's 22,000, and that will follow. So it's a serious investment, but packaging it together makes it more efficient and more coherent.
Yep. No, that makes sense to me. Thanks very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And just to confirm, when you do get analysis on Operation Make Safe, the committee would really be interested to read that. Thank you. We're now moving on to the last section, which is stop and search. So my first question is, how is the Met ensuring that stop and search powers related to protest are not conflicting with the right to peaceful procession and assembly?
Thank you very much. There are very few stop and search powers that are aimed at the protest situation, which is probably right and proper. The key one is the more recent one from the Public Order Act of 2023, which was about, it's basically aimed at the issue of lock-on devices. So people who in a protest are locking on to street furniture or I know, front doors of buildings, etc., which is massively disruptive. And once that lock-on is achieved, it can take a long time to safely remove that. Because once you decide that you're not actually going to like seriously injure the person by dragging them off it and breaking limbs, then it's a long, laborious process. So preventing it is, I think, the reason behind the government the last government creating this piece of legislation. Not many protests are focused on lock-on. We haven't seen any of that around the sort of PSC protests, for example. We've tended to see some of it around environmental protests and one or two other sort of narrow interest groups. To give a sense of the scale of it since this came into power, so there's two parts to it. There's a with suspicion and there's a sort of without suspicion and authority. With suspicion, so an individual officer saying, actually, I believe this person may have I've got grounds to believe they've got devices on them that may be used in this circumstance. We've got 8 recorded cases of this in that sort of, what's that sort of year, 18-month period. The second power, which is when a senior officer gives a authority to stop and search on a particular operation, where the senior officer's got the suspicion, but got the grounds, but the individual officer doesn't need the suspicion. That sort of more broad-reaching authority has been given on 3 occasions and has led to 49 individuals being searched. So if you look at that, if you think about the scale of protests we've had over the last 18 months or so, it's pretty minuscule numbers, which I think is perfectly right and proper, and it just reflects the sort of the small proportion of protest that is linked to lock-on devices.
So tell me, if you do a stop and search and somebody's got spray paint, as an example, on them, or glue or illegal flags, Hamas flags or whatever, would then the officer take that off those individuals?
Yeah, so those are different offences. So if you've got spray paint, possessing spray paint isn't illegal. If I've got reason to believe that you're possessing it with the intent to cause criminal damage, then if I've got grounds to do that, then you're going to be arrested for possessing articles with intent to cause criminal damage. Likewise, if you've got a flag which is illegal, we now know you've got a flag which is, I know, supporting Hamas or ISIS or Al-Qaeda or some other prescribed group, then you'll be arrested for possessing that prescribed item. So those are all possible. This stop and search power was aimed simply at filling a gap that we had operations where we were confident, well, in our intelligence, that group of protesters had lock-on devices, but actually the law didn't provide a stop and search power, and that was why the government filled that.
Yeah.
Whereas those other situations you're articulating are things we do come across, but they're not things that required new powers.
No, I was interested. Thank you very much. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. Commissioner, I just wanted to come to the Stop and Search Charter. Do you know when that will be published?
It's planned in the next few weeks. I can't remember the exact date, but it's not far away.
Okay.
27th of Feb, Kaya says. I'm sure that's right then.
27th of Feb.
Yeah.
Okay. And obviously, I don't need to remind you that the publication date for that was originally October 2023. But are you confident now that that is in a way, in a place where it will support both the public and officers in that work? That's for
Absolutely.
both of you, so I don't know. Yeah, go.
So can I go first, Kaya, if that's all right? So definitely, I think that October date was probably put in an original plan over enthusiastically, to be candid. We could easily have created a charter in a few days. It would have had no engagement with the community whatsoever, though. So I think it was over enthusiastic in its speed. The team, led by many of you will know DAC Adelakin, who leads our public order world and is leading on this for us, is outstanding. They've really approached it from a let's reach out to communities, particularly those who are most questioning about stop and search, and be really clear what's their expectation. It's created very much bottom up. It was quite a bold process they ran, where they started with a blank sheet of paper, and I think it's all the better for it. I think it's very powerful that how strong the data is that young people, the vast majority of them, value stop and search. They want stop and search. They recognise it has a big role in protecting them and their friends and others from knife crime. And of course, they want it done respectfully and sort of those sort of factors, and that's what's being captured in the protocol. So it's very much, the charter is very much a bottom-up document. I will be really clear when we launch it that stop and search works. It reduces violence. We want to do more of it, and this is a document which licenses and legitimises how we do it. It's important. It's not intended to send a message that we're stepping back from stop and search because we've got this charter. It's quite the opposite. This is a sort of enabling document about how communities, even those who are most critical of it, want it used. But I will be very clear that it works. We need to do more of it.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a really good detailed briefing from Ade, and very much as the Commissioner says, I think the amount of consultation work that has gone into the Charter is really important. The fact that the consultation groups have purposely spoken to minoritized communities, to young people, as I was very much struck, as the Commissioner mentioned, that Ade was clear that they weren't presenting a charter and asking people what they felt about it. They were saying to communities, this is a blank page about, how will you stop and search? What do you feel should be in the charter? And I think, the progress that has been made on that basis, I hope will be a significant moment when that charter is published, because it's rooted rightly in the community transparency that I know we've talked a lot about at this committee. And
police officers, right?
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, when I was at Holborn the other day, I was really struck by the officers talking very passionately about how body-worn cameras have improved their ability to police. So, and I know that the way the Stop and Search Charter is also being implemented comes with additional training, because they want officers to be confident in being able to deliver this tactic fairly proportionately, but to be able to deliver it, I think, there's been 4,000 weapons alone in the last year taken off the streets through stop and search. So it's important, but it's important that it's done right and effectively.
Yeah, and just so this is what personally I'd be looking for is the confidence it gives to officers through having the stop and search charter that they can go back to. Is there anything else that you would raise that you are doing to give officers' confidence to use stop and search, because don't want to teach you to suck eggs, but you obviously know officers aren't. I mean, from everyone I speak to, it's almost more hassle than it's worth a lot of times.
So stop and search has halved in the last 3 years in London. That is not good. Our other operational activity, helpfully, is help keep sort of violence down in the way I discussed earlier on. But there are too many knives out there. It is deeply troubling. So the other factor in this, is about officers' accountability and how that works. And I think sometimes people think I'm slightly sort of schizophrenic, but it is coherent. You've heard me speak publicly about officers needing greater confidence that they will be treated fairly when they use their powers as given by Parliament against difficult and dangerous people. That the system is perversely too tough on officers in that situation, at the same time as the conversation we started this morning with being too restrictive when officers are clearly unacceptable and not being able to deal with them. That's a badly set set of regulations does both of those. So that's why I've been so forthright on the accountability issues. It was good that Sir Mark had the review. It landed on James Cleverly's watch. It didn't get followed through. Yvette Cooper, as new Home Secretary, has followed through on it, and those steps are being taken. One of the early steps is the DPP issued new guidance on prosecution of police officers only about 3 weeks ago. Police officers who make sort of decisions, basically split-second decisions in fast time in operational situations, and about sort of recognising some of the wider considerations in that. So getting the right framework around officers so that if an officer needs to feel, if I'm trying my best to work within my training, the world shouldn't fall on top of me if someone complains about it. Maybe I've got it perfectly right, maybe there's some learning for me, but if I'm acting with good intent, then the world shouldn't land on top of me, and that's what they worry about at the moment. We're doing work in terms of how we process and deal with issues internally to try and speed that up, and the new Director General of the IPC is trying to find a more balanced approach. But changes in regulations and law are really important, and so the new Home Secretary has delivered some of that, and there's more to do. And that's critical. So that's why earlier on, when I was talking about the launch of this needs to be about stop and search works. We need to do more of it, and we're going to do it in the way the community support like this. That's the point of this. It's not simply it's not about saying, let's go. It's not a coded message for going soft on stop and search. Quite the opposite. It's about this legitimises it because it's what young people are telling us about how they want it done.
Good. We look forward to seeing that. I suppose the only question I had around that, though, is new charter, training attached to that charter, shrinking budget. Is this achievable?
That's why we've got tough choices, because I'm making. So that does sound slightly glib, but that's genuinely the case. And someone earlier asked the question about the new Met for London budget. So with the budgetary pressures, you could decide we're not going to try and do anything better. We're just going to shrink. We're not going to have any investment in improving anything. That's clearly not what's required. So by keeping some money in new Met for London for strengthening areas, by the resources we've strengthened in training to be able to do this good work, for example, all of that is about taking us forward, because we've got to keep going forward. But if the overall envelope is tight, we have to make choice on things. Well, it's more important to go forward in this area, and this is so critical because it's about the safety of people on the streets, that it's issues like that together with sort of more general budget pressures which create the tough choices, and that's the balance, which is why the strategy, which starts from more trust, less crime, high standards, what's going to deliver that, things like neighbourhood policing, rebalancing, so we're doing a decent service on VORG. You start from those principles and you work your way through, and the strategy drives the action and the budget.
Thank you. And I just really hope this does get communicated to officers as something to support them as much as something to build trust in the community.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garbett.
Thank you. Just to pick up on what you were just saying about it working, at our last committee, one of the professors was saying that stop and search-like practices are minimally effective and would require a huge increase in volume to see a small decrease in targeted crimes. And other studies have found that the effect of stop and search on crime is marginal at best. So I just wondered if those are considered when you've looked at the tactic.
We've done some. I don't think the quality of the research out there on stop and search is that good. We've done some. We've got some fresh work which will be published soon, which shows, in the London context, the effect of stop and search on knife crime and violence is very significant, and that looks at 15 to 18 years data and shows us a very significant correlation in terms of, more stop and search, less violence. So it absolutely works, and instinctively it ought to, hadn't it? In the sense of, if you're likely to end up being arrested if you carry a weapon, then you're less likely to carry a weapon. But there needs to be enough stop and search to bring that about. The other thing that persuades me it works, when the law got tougher on firearms around the turn of the century, when there was a lot of shootings in London, and that enabled different policing tactics and people to go into prison for a long time, people changed criminals changed their approach. They carry guns less often. It gives us different tactical options. And if you compare gun crime now to 20 odd years ago, there's no comparison. So enforcement can have an effect. And so I've got some very powerful data.
And then it'd be really interesting to see that study. And does it look at other interventions such as amnesties or the great work for the Violence Reduction Unit, which we've heard reduces people's risk to others by like 77% by being involved with a youth worker? So does the study take it kind of in the round of the other things that have happened in the last few years, like the Violence Reduction Unit and other things?
So they're different types of interventions, aren't they? I don't think they're comparable. So, of course, if we can do educational initiatives that reduce the number of kids who want to carry weapons, we stop them making bad life choices, that's great. But that's not going to... And if somebody wants to clear out some knives that a mother wants to clear out some knives that her teenage son who's now in prison has left in the house, then that's great as well. But people who are involved in crime, who are carrying weapons, are not going to give them in. They won't all engage with youth workers. So that's not saying we shouldn't try.
Yeah, I guess it's looking at in the round.
So of course we should have a balanced strategy, but I'm slightly concerned that your implication is that a balanced strategy, therefore, because you can do some other things, you don't need to do the enforcement stuff. I mean, if only that were true. The enforcement
That's
has
not
to be
what I
part
was
of
saying. I was saying, did your study look at those other interventions? I'll look out for the data and we can maybe pick it up then.
I don't think I've ever seen a social science study that is able to rigorously look in the complexity of any city at different balances of different types of interventions and make an absolutely scientific judgment saying this is the right balance. We clearly need prevention, diversion, enforcement, and we have to make some judgments on the best mix of them. At the moment, I think the evidence is clear, as we'll bring it forward, that stop and search works. It's reduced by half. There are concerns about knife crime, we need to be doing more of it, and communities support it, and so all of that comes together for me. We will be doing, I want us to be doing more of it, but picking up Emma's point, I've got to do work to build officers' confidence to do it, and I'm completely, so much as I was robust about officers are confident on sexual exploitation cases, and I'm seeing evidence on this, the confidence is much more fragile, and we've got to build that, and some of that's me, some of that's the IOPC, some of that's the law, and that's what we're doing.
I guess it's interesting that we've been focusing on knife violence, which is, completely understandable. But most of the stops that take place, so 56%, are on the suspicion of drugs.
And so, on your previous questions, we talked, didn't we, about how our enforcement in the drugs market is linked to violence. So, so much of London's violence is linked to gangs, which is linked to drugs. So, the drug searches are often a part of that weapons reduction. So if you've got a gang who are selling drugs, some of the time they're carrying they're carrying weapons. So the officer's suspicion in that moment may be that this young man has got drugs, but in the back of his or her mind is actually, I've got suspicion they've got drugs, but they're part of gangs, who knows what else they might have. So it is not... Academics like to pretend that drug searches are done for one purpose, and weapon searches are done for an entirely separate purpose. That's a theoretical, desk-based analysis. That's not the real world. When drugs and violence are so entwined, those searches are part of the same package of keeping our streets safe.
So in the majority of the drug searches, because obviously 70% of the stops don't result in anything, so...
They might result in somebody being reminded it's not a good idea to carry a weapon.
Okay. I just would test that anyone carrying drugs is carrying a knife as a theory. Just if you're stopping someone who's using street heroin or cannabis, or is that a theory? You know, or someone using MDMA on a night out. Like, is it a common assumption of all drugs that there's a knife?
That wasn't the point I made. The point I made was about drugs and gangs. That was the point I made, and that's where the link is very, very strong. Going back to sort of the child, linking this to the child exploitation point, our county lines and city lines operations, we are the last data I saw. So we, from the phone numbers that are running these lines, we identify the people and the location behind them, and we arrest them. They are men of violence. The people running these lines are men of violence, full stop, no ifs, no buts, no maybes. The last data I saw, more than 80% of them have got violence convictions and track records. 1 in 10 of them have been arrested for homicide. 1 in 6 of them are arrested for firearms offences. 1 in 3 of them are arrested for GBH. They are men of violence behind the lines, and they are coercing the kids who are running the drugs, and those kids are then graduating, and then we see these videos after a court case where you've got 2 15-year-olds doing gruesome things to each other with machetes. It's all tied together, and our job is to break that. And enforcement has a big role to play to break it, just as when we spot the 14-year-old before it's too late for him to change his life choices, we desperately need the help of charities and youth services to try and drag them back into better life choices and to help the family sort of rebalance. We need the combination of prevention and enforcement, but we should not pretend that there's some sort of theoretical separate drugs world over here and violence over here.
No, and that's not what I'm pretending at all. But just quickly on county lines, so the National Police Chiefs Council, so the NPCC, released data in November that's national, and I just wanted to test if this is the same picture in London. So they've said that external county lines have decreased by 12.2%, but internal county lines have increased by 232%. So I just wondered if that's similar for London.
We're doing a lot of operations, both in terms of external, as in, I know, drugs from the centre of London to Winchester, and internal drugs from the centre of London to, I know, Kingston, picking the same train line. So we're doing operations of both those types. I don't know the exact ratio between them. The nature of the gangs in London mean, I think, in terms of county lines and disruptions in the country, I think we're doing north of 30% of them in the country, which is disproportionate, which shows it's a big factor here, which again goes to the significance of our work to disrupt those gangs.
But then they're obviously increasing, so obviously it's just testing if that's working as an approach.
We've got fewer teenagers being stabbed, we've got lower murder rate, so and this work is contributing towards that.
Thank you.
I must just say, Commissioner, if we ask you to keep us safe, it is our duty to make sure we give you every tool in the book. And I personally think stop and search is a damn good thing, and I hope it does increase. We've got to get a bit of a wriggle on. Assembly Member Cooper. No?
I was just going to ask the Commissioner about whether he felt that county lines was central both to the issues about grooming in London as well as knife crime, and that tackling county lines is integral to tackling both of those areas. But I think you've started to touch very early on.
It's a Ronnie sketch, isn't it? Answering the next question. I think I've covered it.
You've done this before.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you. Commissioner, as you are aware, the pilot studies for precision stop and search took place in Barking and in Lambeth in my constituency. I've never heard about any evaluation from this, and we're talking about the Charter. So are we talking about stop and search, or are we specifically talking about precision stop and search?
No, we were talking about stop and search for the Charter, so it's about all stop and search. Those were tests of hotspot policing. They delivered some results. They were reasonable. They weren't spectacular, and that's that. And I'm sure if you wanted a more detailed conversation, your local BCU commander could fill you in.
Sure. So we're not going to be seeing the rolling out of precision stop and search across London.
It was one particular project. You will see stop and search done more in this place than that place because we target hotspots. So where is the violence? Where is the risk? Where is the danger to communities? Where are the weapons offences? Where are the street robberies using knives? So we will target that offence. So that's why stop and search doesn't fall evenly across London, because knife crime doesn't fall evenly across London. I saw some data a while ago. I think it's close to 2/3 of London's, if you divide London into small sort of hexagon areas a few hundred metres across, 2/3 of London hasn't had a knife crime in 2 years. A third of it. So it's concentrated in certain areas. That won't be surprising to all of us who've lived in London a long time. And so you target your searches where those areas are.
Thank you. Commissioner, with the Charter, what's going to be put in place to measure the impact and in improving whether trust has increased within communities as a result of the Charter?
So this, for me, I see those two things as quite separate. So we've got the themes in the Charter on things like focus, the quality of the encounter, improved supervision, training, complaints handling, use of technology, independent governance and scrutiny, and sort of quality assurance, community engagement about why it's being used, better public understanding. So all of those have got plans behind them and themes, and sort of that being detailed in the report. It's going to be very difficult to show a direct causal link between that and any other changes in trust and confidence, because those are affected by so many other factors on a weekly basis. But we are continually tracking trust and confidence. The most reliable survey is the National Crime Survey of England and Wales, funded by the Home Office, and we track it through that. And so we also keep an eye on the sort of less robust but still useful data from the work that MOPAC do.
Okay, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, obviously, I know that you know, Assembly Member Ahmed, that we do regular surveys of Londoners, and trust and confidence is always on that, and so that we have quite granular details about the levels of trust and confidence specific to, you know, gender, communities, background, and we can layer that, and that's why you know, in the new police and crime plan, we have 9 areas that we have evaluated as increasing trust and confidence, so that we can monitor that. And you know, obviously MOPAC is currently doing a piece of work using independent assessors to look at stop and search and the grounds for which stop and search happens, doing dip sampling. So we're pulling all of those together to, you know, support the Met in making sure that they can use these tactics effectively.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. This is a question for the Commissioner, and what action is the Met taking to ensure, it may have been answered, by the way, we've been into a lot of detail, but what action is the Met taking to ensure all officers are communicating the grounds for suspicion clearly and accurately prior to conducting a search, and how is this being monitored?
We've done a lot of work to strengthen this, and I'm sort of really proud of the progress on this. And again, this is something that the Inspectorate have looked at quite recently. They're fairly tough judges of this from looking at body-worn video, and it's now sort of more than 94% they assessed independently do a very good job at justifying the grounds. That's moved up from, historically, it was as low as 75% in previous assessments. So the vast majority of them. 98.6% of cases, officers are using body-worn video. And the expectation is in all cases, of course, occasionally people will forget it or that kit will have broken that day, etc. Obviously, if there's a pattern of an officer never using body-worn video, then we'd be suspicious. I think one of the things that reassures me about the integrity of officers is their enthusiasm for body-worn video, as was mentioned earlier by Deputy Mayor. In fact, I think I was sat in front of a different version of this sort of group 12 years ago as Assistant Commissioner. I led the rollout of body-worn video into 2012, 13, 14 in the Met, which is at that stage the biggest pilot in the world. Officers were nervous. The first place we put it, they were nervous about it for about the first 4 or 8 weeks. Is this spying on me or whatever? And very quickly it was like, this is my best friend, because I know I behaved well. People make lots of nonsense allegations. Actually, this is my best friend. This provides me with cover because I behave professionally. And officers are very enthusiastic about it and wouldn't go out without it. And so that's reassuring about officers' intent. And so this is really about officers' skills under pressure and improving that. So we have a process with which supervisors dip sample cases, and we have community scrutiny groups, and sort of MOPAC have been instrumental in helping set those up and get the right membership of it and looking at them. Focusing most generally on sort of learning for officers if they've got things wrong without any ill intent. Obviously, very occasionally it might identify sort of misconduct type practice, but most of it's about that improvement. And the Stop and Search Charter will give us a fresh look at how we monitor it. And so monitoring to date, I think, has been very focused on 2 things. The technical quality of it in terms of grounds and those sorts of issues, and and then the efficacy of it in terms of was anything found. Where the charter will take us more towards is also looking at how it's done, has it been done, sort of the right balance of control and respect and those issues as well, which I think is really good. But so there's a good system around it, and the charter will only force us to strengthen that, but nothing that should threaten officers from using it and doing it so confidently.
Thank you. Just one small supplementary, Chair, for me. I'm in contact with a resident who's a mother in Lewisham, whose son, over the years, has undergone dozens of stops and searches, and once he was stopped and searched twice in one day. Their case has been reviewed on a number of occasions, and the stop and searches continue, and obviously the family feel utterly harassed and have lost confidence when it comes to treating Londoners fairly. How do we defend the point, and I use the word we rather than just you.
Thank you.
How do we defend the point that stop and searches are being done proportionately?
So they, in my experience, they almost always are. I'm not saying we don't make mistakes. I've had letters like that from MPs. Sort of, my constituent has told me ... And you look behind the case, and then when you look at the sort of horrific record of the young person, it's not at all surprising, and actually the policing action is entirely reasonable. And in some cases, parents are living in cloud cuckoo land about what their children are engaged in. There will be rare occasions where we're getting it wrong, I don't pretend otherwise, but in the vast majority of circumstances, officers are getting it right. And if a young person is routinely hanging around with, gangs who sell drugs and perpetuate violence, and is being stopped in those situations regularly, then that's what I'd expect officers to do. And it's not a bad thing necessarily that someone stopped that frequently if they are a threat to the local community. So that's the issue underneath. And I think we need to be honest. I mean, sort of as politicians, if you've got a constituent, being honest that sort of actually sometimes this is the right answer. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's the right answer, and actually, of course, you might want to speak to us or make inquiries with us. That's perfectly right. But I think being open to the fact it might be the right answer because of the threat that person poses is what would be helpful.
Okay. I may contact you directly regarding this individual case so that I can understand it further from a different point of view. The Deputy Mayor wishes to come in.
I just wanted to add that's exactly, why my predecessor commissioned this huge piece of research that MOPAC's doing currently on stop and search, so that we have, a really strong evidence base on, where as the Commissioner said, like where the hotspots are, what does that mean for communities, what are the grounds, how, so that we can have a really strong evidence base to look at and have a really important conversation about, why do certain communities feel over-policed, what are the reasons behind that, and that's a piece of work that the Disproportionality Board is doing with the Metropolitan Police to make sure that there is this, huge piece of research that we can look at together.
I suppose one of the logical concerns is that if one particular community is being particularly targeted, then it's not beyond the wit of most criminal gangs to start thinking, well, these people are being targeted on a regular basis, therefore we'll start changing our recruitment patterns to the people who are not being targeted on a regular basis. Just putting it out there as a suggestion.
So we're targeting based on the criminality. So the criminality moves, we move to targeting. But the recruiting to gangs is so geographically based. Yeah. So they are recruiting from the community in that patch, which means particular communities have disproportionate numbers of young men drawn into the violence, because there's that conveyor belt that's in that geography where that gang operates, and it's really tragic. And the thing that's most powerful, and the one group of people who are vehement, and a journalist wrote a very thoughtful piece in the Times about this. There's one bringing it out. The one group of people who are vehement about stop and search works and we need more of it are the mums who've lost their sons to it. Lots of knife crime, and that's the fact, I think, that cuts through all the politics, all the sort of contention, all the heat around this. If the mums who've lost sons are the ones who say we should have more stop and search, they're the ones I want to listen to most.
No, I don't disagree with you on that at all, but it's just I think it's a reasonable question, and it does help to answer, well, to air these questions directly with you, rather than the noises off. Thank you.
Sorry, can I add, Assembly Member Roberts, that I think the Commissioner made a really important point, kind of linked to what you were saying about recruitment. Yeah. There is legislation coming forward on exploitation, and it's a serious loophole, and it needs serious sentencing, because we know one of the major reasons that children are being used is to hide exploitative adults. And, I make this point because that's the recruitment concern that I'm most exercised about, and that exploitation, having proper sentencing around that is enacted, is really key.
Can I come on the back of that? So I'm really grateful. Kai makes a brilliant point, and I wish I'd made it myself. I forgot to, so thank you. There's a serious point here which links stop and search, violence, knife crime, and the exploitation point. If I'm a 20-year-old man of violence running a gang, am I incentivised to recruit kids from my communities, or disincentivised to do it by the way the world works? And I think at the moment there are more incentives than disincentives, because those kids are easily biddable and influenceable. They are less likely to go to prison, so they are a sort of a sustainable workforce because they're less likely to go to prison than adults. It all works in my favour. And there is not a law that deals that in terms of criminal exploitation of children. There are laws like modern slavery and other things which sometimes fit the bill, but they weren't really designed for this purpose, so one wouldn't expect them to generally. So it's in my interest to do that. I think it's good news that the government had in their manifesto to introduce an offence of criminal exploitation of children. If they do that in the right way and with sufficient bite, because if it's a low-level offence, it won't have the bite. If it has sufficient bite and all of a sudden becomes, frankly, for the person running the gang, actually, if I start to use children, I'm doubling the sentence I'm going to get for selling drugs. It might change their behaviour. So I think, because we have to find a way to break the conveyor belt that tragically is particularly awful in some of London's black communities, that is drawing kids into this violence, and then they end up being the victims and the offenders, and it's just horrible. And having seen some videos of some recent incidents, it's really upsetting to see what you've got 14, 15, 16-year-olds doing. We have to break that conveyor belt, and I think some of that is, as we talked about earlier, better and better prevention and diversion work, but some of it is we have to break the criminal business model. At the moment, the criminal business model for a gang leader, it sort of makes sense to bring kids into your empire. We need to make that a high-risk strategy for them.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I'm sure there'd be cross-party agreement on anything that can go ahead that would help with that. A last question coming in from Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Hello, both. I'm interested in disproportionality. I'm going to go to the Deputy Mayor first. Are you confident that the work you're doing on disproportionality is focusing on the right areas? Because this conversation in the black community was led by the usual suspects. I believe the conversation has got elsewhere. So are you confident you're focusing on the correct areas in disproportionality? Are you arriving with any preconceived ideas about that?
I mean, let me be clear, it's not my preconceived ideas that are driving the research. It's a robust research framework that has been developed alongside the Metropolitan Police about what to look at, and is being done by a range of, that's why we've got kind of independent members of the community, all communities, looking at the data and seeing and doing dip sampling and seeing, you know, thousands of cases, so that we have the widest data set. It's got nothing to do with, it doesn't have a value set on it. It's just looking at the police data, body-worn camera footage, and you know.
It's hard to have this conversation and there not be a value set on it when the people are analysing it. That's hard. The reason I say that, because the disproportionality I'm most concerned with is the disproportionate number of black boys in particular who are stabbed, robbed and terrorised through knives. I personally think stop and search is one of the only ways to intervene in that process. So is that disproportional negative outcome for the black community, particularly young black men, is that part of the estimates you draw from all of this data?
Sorry, can you clarify
what I'm
the
trying
question?
to suggest is this disproportionality, right? I believe there is disproportionality. I think it's also correct that there is disproportionality in the stop and search, because a particular group of people are being murdered through the lack of stop and search. So I'm asking you the question, are you, when you look at this data, when you start to draw consequences, are you comfortable with the fact that there will be some disproportionality? Because I am, because that's where the police should be concentrating their efforts.
Sure, and I think we recognise that, you know, in the same way as, you know, there is different demographics that are more likely to be in prison for various reasons, that is just factual. But I think the important point, and I think it really should be seen as enabling to the police, is having a data set that says, and I've heard this firsthand, there are, from people who have been regularly stopped and searched, there are good stops and searches that actually have helped get them into other services, have, you know, been, you know, a positive interaction, and there are not. And it's how do we make those pieces of excellence consistent, and I think that's the work that we're trying to do together.
Okay. Commissioner, I think you should be commended on some of the brave statements you've made around disproportionality and why we've had to look at particular parts of the community. The real problem now with stop and search is that it hasn't been supported by the mayor. It's as simple as that. In 2018, he said he'll do everything in his power to cut stop and search. He absolutely said that. And before you tell me he didn't say that, Deputy Mayor, I suggest you Google it. You'll see a big article where he said that. now that you've said that we need to have stop and search as a tactic, are you confident that your officers are able to carry this out in the way you want it carried out?
I'm confident in their capability. I mean, obviously, we've talked about their confidence, and that's something that's work in progress for the reasons we've discussed, and I don't need to repeat it. But I do think it links back to some of the conversation you've just generated, that I think it's a dangerous mistake that the proportionality of police use of powers is debated and presented over here, and the demographics of the way crime and victimisation falls in different communities for a whole range of sort of reasons is talked about over here, and they're not joined together. And what that leads to is an assumption that because police use a tactic more often in one geography or with one community, therefore it's biased, where actually it may just be tragic that that crime is falling more heavily there. And until we sort of join those two together, it puts a very, very heavy blanket on policing confidence, because that's part of the issue that goes to the debate, that sort of saps officers' confidence, saying, actually, well, if I do stop and search in this context with this community, I'm more open to challenge. And people say, well, police are unfairly targeting the community. Actually, we might be dealing with it more often. And you've heard me say this before, but I'll repeat it again. During COVID, the body politic got really energised about the prospect that certain minority groups were twice as likely to be suffering serious health consequences as others, and everyone was really energised about it, worried about it, and looking at it, because this doesn't look fair. I don't see that same energy for the disproportionate victimisation that you talk about. I mean, you've heard the stat I've used, which is, and that's a year out of data, whatever it was, 10 years of data, that sort of black boys in London being sort of 12 or 13 times more likely to be murdered than white boys over a decade. So we ought to be horrified by that, and sort of looking at, well, how policing tactics might need to get more assertive in that context, as well as diversion tactics, education, a whole range of other interventions to help deal with this. And meanwhile, we're stuck in a sort of small p politicised debate about race, when you've got mums of boys grieving their loss, when we're not collectively as enforcement or diversionary agencies doing our best because we're tiptoeing around it.
I couldn't agree more. To Deputy Mayor, do you sometimes think it's hard to statistically measure some of the impacts of stop and search? So I come from a background of over 30 years of youth work. I've dealt with many, many gang-involved young people, and their likelihood to be stopped or not is how they measure if they should carry a weapon or not. So although a stop might not result in any further action by the police, it definitely has a positive reverberation in the community. Do you think it's possible to capture some of that in stats and some of the disproportionality work you're doing?
I mean, I think that's why the importance of mixed methodology is key to this, and I think that goes to the work that's been done through the consultations of the Stop and Search Charter. Also, use quantitative measures, qualitative measures, and that mix of analysis gives you a picture. I don't think there's ever been any research done ever in anything that gives everyone the whole picture of anything. But I think it's important that in order to have oversight, to improve accountability, to improve practice, that we do test hypotheses through research.
Okay. Commissioner, I nearly called you Deputy Commissioner, sorry. Commissioner,
it's been a hard day. I don't mind being demoted on the way as well.
How better do you think the police can demonstrate the connection between people's drug use and crime on the street? For instance, there's lots of people who might use heroin, MDMA, and a nice, polite, middle-class environment and not realise the impact that's having on communities that are disparate to theirs. How do you think we can, as a community, politicians included, demonstrate that there is a direct link and it has an effect in a different community to your own?
I think that's a fantastic question. I don't have a perfect answer, but there must be a way where policing, politicians and the media can work together to really bring this to life, because a lot of those middle-class people will be having their drugs delivered by kids, because that's the sad reality of it. They're a part of that exploitation. It's a pretty depressing picture. And the sort of, we might take a view that they're sort of wealthy and their drug use is more a habit that's best seen as a health issue, etc., on its own, and I don't have a strong view about that, but we should take account of the fact that actually they're putting money into something which is driving the exploitation of kids and drawing them into gangs and into sort of zombie knife fights, and sort of, I know a proportion of them end up in prison for life and a proportion of them end up in coffins.
Thank you. And my last question is, the advent of body-worn camera has been largely good for police officers, but the thing that many police officers will say offline is they wish that the Met would put out the video that they caught to show that
Me too.
Yeah, because the people video, everybody's a journalist these days, and they make a video and it goes straight on social media, it shows the police in a bad light, but the police then have footage that show the whole situation, and many officers would like to release that. Where is the Met on doing that?
So my answer is me too on that one. So I've got a piece of work that's in progress at the moment, having a look at this. It's been looked at multiple times nationally and in London, and every time decided not to. You get into massive complexity about information rights, subjudice, personal data. There's lots of reasons not to do it, but I think we have to find a way through it. I think there's almost two separate sets of issues here. If in the routine we could release fast time material about, this is what we made this arrest in your community the other day, this is how great the officers were, this is what it was about, that would be very powerful. So in terms of a sense of good news and how many great things officers are doing day in day out, it'd be very powerful. And then on the contentious incidents that sort of blow up in the media, we then need to be up for that, because you can't partially open the floodgates on this, can you, once you're going to do it. So, and on those contentious incidents, in my experience, the vast majority of the times, if we show the body-worn video, it would kill the contention overnight. On a small number of them, it'd be, yeah, we got that drastically wrong, this needs an investigation, bear with us. But I think it would be really powerful. I say, the sort of information, privacy rights, there's a whole load of stuff we've got to wade through, but I've got a senior member of the team working on it, and if I can find a way to do it, I will do it.
Okay. I think many officers would welcome that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. They would. I was told by Cressida Dick, because I've complained about this so many times, that the IOPC put a stop to it, but I'll leave that there. Len has got a very short...
They can have an opinion.
Sorry?
They can have an opinion.
Right now.
Can I just say, look, I welcome this conversation that we're having and the relaunch and repurposing around stop and search. I've always thought it was a very important police tool. I welcome your approach of how you've answered it. It's not just about enforcement, there is a prevention side. But the missing bit of our conversation is this. Once we've done the charter, once we've relaunched, once we're training staff, we need a bit of a communications plan here. A communications plan that's more realistic. Too often on social media I see a 20-second clip that says one version of an incident that portrays the police being over the top. Some people would say disproportionality, I don't. And when the real facts emerge, it's a very legitimate intervention by the police. You're held back sometimes because there's an investigation and complaints have gone in. There must be a case for public good and confidence in policing of where, if there is information and it's clear cut, I'm not against holding people to accountability when they get it wrong, but if it's clear cut and the information is different, then you should be able to put that into the public domain. And you should be able to defend yourself. I do think there are some issues of the past that we need to learn. There can be no mixed messages on this. We do stop and search. Yes, it's very intrusive and not very nice. It can be done by consent, I grant that, but equally it needs to happen to protect ourselves. You said a stat earlier on, 4,000 knives off the street tells me that's over 1,000 potential victims that have been saved by that, probably plus. I won't say 4,000 because we don't know, but if you're carrying a knife, you're more likely going to use it in some certain circumstances. And that's the reality of it. And I just want to say this, there is, and I thought Lord Bailey raised a very important point, there is no crime-free activities relating to that violence drug piece. If you're a middle class going for your weekend recreational drugs, sticking up your nose or whatever, the misery and plight of getting those drugs to your door, onto your table, so you and your friends can share it, is one of criminality. One that is violence, one that's exploitation, and actually it's there. And it's the same for any form of recreational drugs if it's illegal. Now, we can have a debate whether it should be illegal or not. It doesn't matter. That is the system, the business model that gets it to people's to take it. And we need to be clear about that. And that's why I think about the mixed messages that go on from some of us who are united. We want to see less violence in our streets. We just got to think about some of those messages that go on. And I just wanted to say that around that, because there is no crime-free activities there. So I would like you to think further around, both of you really, to think about what that communication plan is and making it clear about enforcement and prevention, what you're really about when we're doing this activity, and how we still continue to take our communities with us. We shouldn't just rest back on polling. We need to constantly talk of what you're doing and why we're doing it, because it's to make us safer. And our young people safer. And just as another aside, it's not just young children being exploited. We see the rise of young women being involved in that criminality and carrying, I think we saw it on gun crime in the early stages. Yeah. We now see it there, young girls, young women, give them the drugs because they won't be stopped and searched. We need to be made clear, if there is an evidence, if there is a view of activity going on in the area, you are likely to be stopped and searched. And you will be, if you're hanging around with the wrong people, it will continue.
That challenge to our community.
People who don't, they'll use somebody else.
Can we hear the answer? And we've got
that challenge to our communications, Leonard, that challenge to our communications completely accept. And in terms of the specifics of the body-worn video, the reason I want us to move to a policy where we do release it, and I'm going to find a way of doing it, is we should lean more heavily on our mission of public trust. The danger is we don't balance that against, so we have lots of duties. We have, information privacy, protecting investigations. There's lots of other missions, but the public trust mission in today's society where the truth, where facts move very quickly and facts and lies move very quickly on social media, unless you get in there early, you're just burning public trust. And you might be right, but if it's 2 years before the world sees that you're actually right, it's forgotten. And the volume of heat you get for the confected criticism is never balanced by the volume of clarity that comes 2 years later. So we have to dive into that. It's messy in our heavily regulated world, but we have to find a way of doing it.
Thank you. Yes, you do, because your hands are tied behind your back at the moment, and that is not helping trust and confidence. You can see most of us absolutely agree with stop and search, and we're absolutely behind you on all of that. So we've now come to the end of the discussion. I'd like to thank our guests for attending this morning and for their answers to our questions. Can I ask committees to note the report and the discussion? Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme for 24-25 Assembly year and the additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, namely the informal briefing on the Vision Zero Plan 2? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place Wednesday, 26th of February 2025 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber, City Hall. I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting.